Alrighty, so today we're going to go over two models with you guys. The first model that I'm going to go over with you is the model for loanable funds. So for this graph, it's going to start like a normal supply and demand graph, that we're going to have supply the sky and demand the dirt. So we've got our normal unit 2 supply and demand graph. And we're going to label this loans, or you can label it loanable funds. All right. So our x-axis is going to be quantity. So that's nothing too special. We're going to label these curves supply and demand. And oftentimes what you'll see is like on the AP test, you might see this, or it really helps students to draw it like this. Our supply, that this is going to be people who are lenders, people who are lending money, and then our demand is going to be people who are borrowers or people who are borrowing money. So the supply is our lenders, the demand is our borrowers. One of the things that I always say to students is, oh, there we go. Let me let Aiden in here. One of the things that I always say to students is that savings is the supply of loans. So that means when we're looking at like shifters on this graph, if something causes people to save more, then our supply would increase. If something causes people to save less, then supply would decrease. So like if you had a scenario that basically said, what would happen if the federal government decided that it was going to create a new savings program to help kids save for college, and that the government was willing to match dollar for dollar every dollar that a child puts in their savings account. Well, then a lot more kids are going to start saving a lot more money in their savings account because they can get it matched by the government. So savings would go up, and so that would cause this to shift to the right, and then that would change our equilibrium. So savings is the supply of loans. On the demand side, where we have borrowers, the main shifters for demand would be anything that causes people to usually it'd be things like consumer confidence would make people want to get more loans or borrow more money because they're feeling better about the future. Or it would be like a good business outlook, that if the business outlook is positive, then businesses may want to borrow more money to expand and make more profit in a good economic conditions. So like good economic conditions would lead to more borrowing, increase of demand for loans. We're actually seeing that right now in our economy, that in the last 2 weeks, interest rates have started to go up. And the reason why interest rates have gone up is because people, it seems like as more people get vaccinated, that it's leading to this feeling of like, we're ready for this to be over. Once I'm vaccinated, I don't need to worry about it. I want to go out and I want to be able to go to restaurants or movies or on vacation. And I want to go out and spend money and feel normal again. So that we're anticipating this increase in spending, and has already got businesses and people feeling good, which has caused the demand for loans to start to increase to the right, causing our real interest rate to go up. So on my y-axis, we have real interest rate. Now, sometimes students worry about whether they'll, how do I remember that that's the real interest rate, or like on the money market graph, how do I remember that that's nominal interest rate? Usually a question will reveal whether it's the real or nominal interest rate for you. So you don't have to have it memorized. You just have to remember that it's an interest rate and that the question will tell you. So like on a loanable funds question, the question on an FRQ would be something like this. Using a correctly labeled graph of loanable funds, show the impact of increased savings on the real interest rate. So then you would say, okay, increased savings is the supply of loans, savings shifts to the right. And in the question, it asks you the impact on the real interest rate. So then that's how you know to put real interest rate up there on your loanable funds graph. If you had a question about the money market, it would more likely be something like this. The question on the money market would say, using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show the impact of the Federal Reserve's new policy on the nominal interest rate. So the question would reveal for the money market graph that it's the nominal interest rate that goes on that y-axis. So we've got our real interest rate here. We've got our supply, which is basically, it says lenders, but it's really banks that are the supply of loans. That's where people go to get loans, is they go to banks, and banks lend out money, right? So, and then we've got the demand down here as our borrowers. And based on those two forces, we get an equilibrium real interest rate. So I use a lowercase r for my real interest rate there. So we've got R sub E for our equilibrium interest rate. Now, again, shifters for this graph. On the supply side, anything that affects savings would affect our supply of loans. On the demand side, anything that affects people's willingness to borrow money. So it would be like economic outlook for businesses and consumers. There's two other, key scenarios that you need to be aware of with this graph, right? The first one is what happens when we have an increase in government debt. What happens when the government borrows more money to finance higher levels of spending? Now, this one is a little bit weird because different professors teach it different ways. So I'm going to show you two different ways to show what happens when we have an increase in government spending. So when government spending goes up and it leads to an increase in borrowing, the way that the government actually borrows money is that it actually issues bonds. So if the government wants $1 billion to spend, then the government's going to have to issue $1 billion worth of bonds. So they say, well, you give us the money today, and then we'll pay you interest over time, 2 times a year or whatever, and then we'll pay you your money back. And there's 1-year government bonds, there's 10-year government bonds, there's 30-year government bonds, right? So there's all different lengths of government bonds that you can be purchasing. But at the end of the day, when people go to buy those government bonds, we need to be able to show that effect on this graph. Now, commonly, there's 2 common ways that professors kind of demonstrate that increased borrowing by the government on this graph. The way that I prefer, the way that what I would do is I would show this as people taking the money out of their bank accounts to go buy bonds. People taking money out of their bank means that we have a decreased supply of money for banks to lend, so that our supply is decreasing to the left, which causes my real interest rate to increase. So you can see that with the purple, we decreased our supply of loans to show what's happening, and it's causing the real interest rate to go up, right? And we call this crowding out, when the government borrows money and it causes interest rates to go up, which then is harmful to everybody else in the economy because they have to pay higher interest rates now. This is called crowding out. Now, the other way that you could show what happens when the government borrows a lot of money is that you could go, well, if the government's borrowing money, that's one more borrower. That's an increase in demand for loans. So you can increase demand to the right and say that the government is borrowing money. So that's one more borrower that we have. So we increase the demand for borrowers. Find our new equilibrium. Notice that it matches up perfectly with the increasing interest rate from before. So whether you decrease supply or increase demand when the government borrows money, in both instances, it causes that real interest rate to go up. So we have a rising real interest rate. That means that for other borrowers in the economy, that they're going to have to pay that they're going to be paying higher interest rates. So again, we call that crowding out. So one kind of scenario that you might see where it's, a common scenario that might lead to a change in this market would be an increase in government borrowing. A decrease in government borrowing would just do the opposite. If it was a decrease in government borrowing, then we would increase the supply of private loans. or we would decrease the demand for private loans, and it would cause interest rates to fall either way. So that's government borrowing. The other scenario that we need to pay attention to with this graph is what happens when we have other countries with different real interest rates. So let's look at that now. So I erased my graph. We're going to redraw this here. So I've got my axes, real interest rate, quantity, supply to the sky, demand to the dirt, labeled at loans. All right, and I labeled lenders are the ones that are supplying and borrowers are the ones that are demanding. And now let me put my equilibrium interest rate in here. Now, we've got our equilibrium real interest rate. Let's say that that equilibrium real interest rate, let's say that it's 3% for the United States, right? So I labeled that 3%, 3% for the United States. What would happen if the real interest rate was, let's say, 5% in Canada, right? So we'll say Canada with a 5% real interest rate. What would that do to this model? Well, we stop to think about it, right? Canada with its 5% real interest rate, what does that mean? For me, it doesn't really mean anything, right? For you guys, it probably doesn't really mean anything as well. But if you were very wealthy, right? If you had millions or tens of millions of dollars, right? Maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars saved, you might consider buying a Canadian bond instead of putting your money in an American bank. Or you might consider putting your money in a Canadian bank instead of an American bank, because that Canadian bank is paying a higher real interest rate than American banks are. So if another country has a higher real interest rate, right, what's going to happen is it's going to cause people to take their money out of American banks and put them into those Canadian banks. So if this is the US market for loanable funds, that means, right, remember, savings is the supply of loans. So if people are taking their money out of American banks, saving in America goes down, and then the supply in Canada would go up. But we're not looking at the Canadian market, we're looking at the American market. So supply would go down, which causes my real interest rate to go up. Notice that in Canada, I said that their supply would increase, causing their real interest rate to fall. So money is going to leave the United States where the interest rate is low, and it's going to go where the interest rate is high. We call this capital flow. Capital flow is where money leaves countries with low interest rates to go into countries with high real interest rates to capture a higher real rate of return. When the money's going out, we call that capital outflow. When the money is coming in, we call that capital inflow. So what we have up here is capital outflow because of the low interest rate in the United States, causing that money to leave, which causes our real interest rate to go up. At the same time, the Canadian real interest rate should go down. Now, what this means in theory is that all, stable economies, all major countries with stable economies, their real interest rates should be in equilibrium. Because if anybody's real interest rate is higher than anyone else's, then money is going to flow into that country until that real interest rate falls even with everyone else. If anybody's real interest rate is lower than everyone else's, then money is going to flow out of that country until their real interest rate moves up and is equilibrium with everyone else. So based on the idea of capital flow, the real interest rates in all countries should be approximately the same. So that's our loanable funds graph, right? We've got normal unit 2, supply to the sky, demand to the dirt. We have a different y-axis. We have real interest rate on our y-axis. The shifters of supply is going to be anything that affects, the savings in banks. The shifters of demand is going to be anything that makes people want to borrow more, spend more, usually. The big scenarios that we see on test questions often, capital flow, where different real interest rates in different countries cause supply and demand to change. for supply to change, I guess, of currencies. And then when we have government debt, that will also change the real interest rate in a country. So that's the market for loanable funds. Again, if you guys who are in here right now, if you have any questions, you guys can put those in the chat and I'll see those questions. But that's loanable funds. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at the market for currency trade or currency exchanges. So we'll look at foreign exchange. But before I do that, do you guys have any questions on loanable funds? All right. So for foreign exchange, when we look at the model for foreign exchange, we're going to be looking to see. We're going to be looking at the exchange rate for a currency. So the exchange rate is when you go to trade some amount of trade one currency to turn it into another currency. So if you ever traveled to another country, maybe you've exchanged US dollars and you've bought and you got another currency. You know, if you're going to sometimes I know they used to have a place at Mission Valley Mall. They might still have one, I'm not sure. But sometimes you'll even see places that are called currency exchanges, where it'll be a little store and they'll have all different kinds of money and you can go in there and you could trade one money for another. There's a market for the trading of currencies. We call that the foreign exchange market, or FOREX for short. So today I'm going to be going over FOREX. I'm going to be going over, wow, that looks terrible. I'm going to be going over Forex with you guys today. So the foreign exchange market. When it comes to, sorry about that. When it comes to currencies and trading currencies and exchanging currencies, you always have to compare one country to another. So if we're looking at like the United States dollar and we want to know what's happening to the value of a dollar, we have to compare it to another currency to know what's happening to the value of that currency. There is no like abstract measure of the value of a currency relative to others. It has to be a relative measure. So we have to look at like the US dollar against the peso, or the Canadian dollar, or the euro, or the pound sterling, or the yen, or the won, or whatever the other currency is, you know, the Indian rupee, or whatever it is that we're looking at. That's going to be our basis of comparison. So in this model, we're going to have two currencies that we're comparing. So I highly recommend that you make two graphs. They don't have to line up. This isn't like the Phillips curve in aggregate demand, aggregate supply, where they have to like line up next to each other or anything like that. It's just for our foreign exchange market. We're going to have two graphs for the two countries, right? So I see a question in the chat there and it asks, does the US have any currency besides the dollar bill? Officially, no. In the United States, officially our currency is the dollar bill, and that's the official money that's used for transactions. However, an unofficial currency that you can use in some places in the United States would be Bitcoin. So that would be another currency that you could trade for. And you could even have a graph for the US dollar and Bitcoin, and you could show the exchange rate for those two things. So we've got two countries here. I'm going to do the United States. And then I'm going to do over here for my other graph, I'm going to do Japan. So in this scenario, we're going to be trading dollars for yen. Now, when we go to set up our currency, the model for currency exchange, it's once again supply and demand. And again, they don't have to line up. This isn't like the Phillips curve in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. They don't have to line up. It doesn't really matter. All we're going to be looking at is their equilibriums and what their equilibrium price does. So we've got the supply, we've got demand, and we've got quantity. Now, what this represents the supply, represents anybody who would be willing to trade away US dollars or anybody who'd be willing to trade Japanese yen. That's the supply. The demand would be anybody who might want to trade theirs for something else. So the demand is somebody who wants to get something else. The supply is somebody who's willing to trade depending on the price. And so we've got our supply and our demand for these two various currencies. And then we have these equilibriums. Now, our y-axis is going to be, this is probably the most confusing part for students. For the US dollar, the y-axis is going to be the number of yen that you can get for your dollar. So it's going to be measured in yen per $1. So how many yen do you get for your dollar? For Japan, our y-axis is going to tell us how many dollars we get for our yen. So dollars divided by yen. It's always the y-axis on this graph. It's always the other currency over the currency you're looking at. So for US dollars, it's the other currency, whether it's euros or whether it's rupees or Canadian dollars or pesos or whatever the other currency is, it goes on top, and then the currency you're looking at goes on the bottom. For Japan, I put the US on top and then the Japanese yen on the bottom. So that's our y-axis. Over here on the side, you could just use an E for equilibrium, or you could even use a P sub E for equilibrium price of that currency. I usually use P for price, but you have to make sure that your y-axis is labeled correctly. If you don't have this or you don't have that and you just have the P, then you're going to get that marked wrong on my test and on the AP test if you don't have the correct, again, if I have a question like this on my test and I ask you to do a correctly labeled graph, then I'm going to be looking at that when I go to grade the correctly labeled. I'm going to be looking, do you have the right y-axis? So here we have it set up. We've got our equilibrium price for our two currencies. Now there's a couple vocabulary terms that you need to know. When the price of a currency goes up, we say that that currency is appreciating. So the currency is going up in value relative to the other currency. So I would say, like, if the US price goes up, I would say that the US dollar is appreciating relative to Japanese yen. Or if the price of a currency goes down, we would say that that currency depreciates relative to the other currency, right? If the value of yen goes down, it depreciates relative to the US dollar. In this scenario, or in any one of these scenarios where we have two currencies being compared to each other, if one is appreciating, the other has to depreciate. Because by definition, if they're compared to each other, if the US dollar is getting more valuable compared to the yen has to be getting less valuable compared to the dollar. So one appreciates and the other depreciates. If you ever do a scenario where they're both appreciating or they're both depreciating, you've done something wrong, because you can't have that. It's a relative value thing. So if one appreciates, it appreciates. If the other one appreciates, it appreciates, but they can't both go up in value compared to each other. All right. So we've got our two graphs here, right? Now, typically your shifters are going to be things like imports and exports. So if anything causes people to want to buy more of another country's stuff, they're going to have to get their currency. So like imports and exports is going to be a big shifter in this model. So like if the price of US products goes down, right, then Japanese people are going to want to buy more stuff because it's cheaper. So price level can be a shifter. If the price level in Japan goes up, then Americans aren't going to want to buy as much Japanese stuff. So then the demand for Japanese yen is going to fall. So imports and exports is a big one. Anything that causes that, like, people to want to import more of a country's things, or it's going to cause a country to want to buy more exports from another country, that's going to affect the supply and demand of currencies. Travel is another common scenario that affects the supply and demand of currencies. That if I'm going to travel to another country, then I'm going to need their currency in order to buy their stuff. So travel is another time where we see if more people travel from one country to the other than the other way around, that would lead to a currency appreciating and the other one depreciating. And we'll go over some of those scenarios. We'll draw those out so you can see. And then the last one, the last big category of shifter for this one would be when we have international investment. So if people want to buy businesses in other countries, or if they want to put their money in a bank in another country, or if they want to buy a bond in another country, they have to get that country's currency before they could do those things. All right. So I saw a question here that asked if I could put the definition of appreciation and depreciation in the chat. I'll actually write it on the board here. So then that way, when I post this video later for people, they could see those definitions written out for appreciation and depreciation. I'm also going to pause the recording real quick because I think the music is about to play for the passing period for period 7 here. So, all right. So you can see here, I've written those definitions out. So we've got appreciation, depreciation. Appreciate is a currency goes up in value compared to another. Depreciate is when a currency goes down in value compared to another. All right. So now that we've got our side-by-side graph here, let's look at an example of what happens. So I've got the United States and I've got Japan here. Let's look at a travel example. So the Olympics are happening in Japan this summer. Let's say that we've got a large number of Americans who want to go to Japan to experience the Olympics and root on their teams, and they want to go to Japan to see that. So what's going to happen? Well, in order to help you guys with this, I'm actually going to move you all real quick. In order to help you with this, I have here, right, a little object lesson. I've got some US dollars, right? So I've got these, we've got this money here that represents US dollars, right? And I got a fat stack of them here. Pull out some more. So I've got US dollars. In addition to US dollars, I've got these other things here, these other like coins that are going to represent yen. So I've got dollars and yen, my two different countries that are trading in this scenario, right? And then here, this bucket represents the foreign exchange market, the market where people trade currencies. Now, in this bucket, in the foreign exchange, you're going to have people, some of whom have yen, right, that they're willing to trade for other currencies. So it represents a tiny portion of the money supply, but there is some people willing to trade some yen for other currencies. Now, in this bucket, there's also people, maybe some of the same people, in fact, or other people who have US dollars that they're willing to trade for other currencies as well. So this is the foreign exchange market, and this is the supply and demand for these two currencies. It's based on the supply is right here, and the demand is based on what people want to take out. That's the demand for these currencies. So in our scenario, we've got Americans want to go to Japan to see the Olympics. Well, what's going to happen? Well, if you think of the foreign exchange, in reality, you can go online and you can trade currencies just like you could trade stocks or bonds. But if you think of the foreign exchange market as an actual physical market that you have to go to when you're going to like exchange with another country, it really helps you to understand what's happening as far as our model goes, right? So we've got Americans, right? And some of those Americans are going to want to go to Japan. And so they're going to have to, when they're in Japan, they're going to want to stay in a Japanese hotel. They're going to want to buy Japanese food. They're going to want to buy souvenirs. They're going to buy tickets to the Olympic sporting events. They might go on tours or do tourist things like go see Mount Fuji or go buy some used video games or whatever it is, right? They're going to want to do these things when they're in Japan. So we're going to take some American dollars, and this represents an increase in the number of Americans who want to go on vacation to Japan because of the Olympics, right? So they're taking their money out of their bank account, right? And they're planning their vacation to Japan. But when they go to Japan, when they go to buy food or hotel or tickets or souvenirs or anything else when they're there, right? The Japanese people don't take US dollars. You need yen in order to buy all of those things. So how do you get yen? That's where the foreign exchange comes in. You stop on your way and you trade your US dollars for Japanese yen. So we've got US dollars here. They're going into the foreign exchange market. You see that? The US dollar is going in. So if we wanted to show that on our graph, we would show that as the supply of dollars is increasing in Forex, right? Because these people who have their dollars and they want yen, they're bringing it in there, right? The supply of dollars goes up. Now, what's the corresponding transaction? You can really do it two different ways. I like to think of it when they're reaching their hand in to get the other thing that they wanted, that's demand. So what's happening is the demand for yen is going up because those people traded their dollars to get the yen that they want in order to buy the things that they want. And because we're using that word want here a lot, I think of it as demand. So, right, we've got these, right? We've got these yen. So now let's go back to our graph. All right. So we go back to our graph. How do we show what just happened? I'll use blue. Right. So Americans who want to go more to the Olympics in Japan, they're going to increase the supply of US dollars in the foreign exchange market. So we see the price going down. That means that US dollars are depreciating. And then to check our answer, we go over to yen to see what's happening in yen, right? Remember, Americans are trying to get more yen, so demand goes up. Japanese yen are going up in value or they are appreciating. Right now, if you wanted to, you could show, instead of showing demand for yen going up, you could show the supply of yen going down, and you get the same answer that it's that the yen are appreciating. So either way, that would work. All right. So let's look at another scenario now. So I'm going to bring you guys back over here. Another scenario here. Let's go and let's look at, again, trade from Japan to the United States. Let's say that the United States has, right? Let's say that the US government has increased its borrowing, and that has caused real interest rates to go up in the United States. So if the United States has higher real interest rates, right? Well, what is that going to do? Let me put those back in there. All right. So the United States has higher real interest rates than Japan. Well, what's going to happen? Well, remember that capital is going to flow. This is kind of connecting Unit 7 to Unit 8. Capital is going to flow to the places where the interest rates are higher. So what's going to happen is people with Japanese money are going to want to save it in American banks where they can get higher interest rates, or maybe buy American bonds where they can get higher interest rates. So when those real interest rate goes up in the United States, what we're going to see is some wealthy Japanese people are going to take their yen and they want to go put it in an American bank. But American banks don't take yen. They want dollars. Or if you're buying an American bond, you can't buy it with yen. You have to buy an American bond with American dollars. So before they can go and put that money in the bank, or before they can buy that bond, they have to stop at Forex first, right? So what's happening because of the higher real interest rates in the United States? The supply of yen is increasing. The demand for dollars, give me those dollars so I could go deposit them in the bank, right? The demand for dollars is going up as well. So they could use that money to buy some American bonds or put it in American banks. So again, going back to our model. There we go. Line that up. All right. So going back to our model right here, what's happening? Well, what we're seeing is the supply of yen is going up. Right? When the supply of yen goes up, yen depreciates. And what's happening in the United States? Demand for US dollars is increasing, causing US dollars to appreciate or to go up in value. So that's our model of foreign exchange. Again, it really helps to think of that example, of that concrete example of like thinking of the foreign exchange as like an island where people have to stop to trade currency, or thinking of it as like a location or a bucket that people have to trade into to get the currency they want. So you can figure out what's happening with supply and demand. So any questions on that foreign exchange model? All righty. Well, that's all I have for you guys for today.